Chapter 12, The Shadow on the Land, by Arthur Conan Doyle. It was still drizzling in the morning, with brown drifting clouds and a damp, chilly wind. It was a queer thing for me as I opened my eyes to think that I should be in a battle that day, though none of us ever thought it would be such a one as it proved to be. We were up and ready, however, with the first light, and as we threw open the doors of our barn, we heard the most lovely music that I had ever listened to playing somewhere in the distance. We all stood in clusters hearkening to it. It was so sweet and innocent and sad-like. But our sergeant laughed when he saw how it pleased us all. "Them are the French bands," said he, "and if you come out here you'll see what some of you may not live to see again." Out we went, the beautiful music still sounding in our ears, and stood on a rise just outside the barn. Down below at the bottom of the slope, about half a musket shot from us, was a snug-tiled farm with a hedge and a bit of an apple orchard. All round it a line of men in red coats and high fur hats were working like bees, knocking holes in the wall and barring up the doors. "Them's the light companies of the guards," said the sergeant. "They'll hold that farm while one of them can wag a finger, but look over yonder and you'll see the camp fires of the French." We looked across the valley at the low ridge upon the further side, and saw 1,000 little yellow points of flame with the dark smoke wreathing up in the heavy air. There was another farmhouse on the further side of the valley, and as we looked we suddenly saw a little group of horsemen appear on a knoll beside it and stare across at us. There were a dozen hussars behind, and in front 5 men, 3 with helmets, 1 with a long straight red feather in his hat, and the last with a low cap. "By God," cried the sergeant, "that's him. That's Boney, the one with the grey horse. I'll lay a month's pay on it." I strained my eyes to see him, this man who had cast that great shadow over Europe, which darkened the nations for 25 years, and which had even fallen across our out-of-the-world little sheep farm, and had dragged us all, myself, Eddie and Jim, out of the lives that our folk had lived before us. As far as I could see, he was a dumpy, square-shouldered kind of man, and he held his double glasses to his eyes with his elbows spread very wide out on each side. I was still staring when I heard the catch of a man's breath by my side, and there was Jim with his eyes glowing like 2 coals, and his face thrust over my shoulder. "That's he, Jock," he whispered. "Yes, that's Boney," said I. No, it's he, this de Lap or de Lissac or whatever his devil's name is. It is he." Then I saw him at once. It was the horseman with the high red feather in his hat. Even at that distance I could have sworn to the slope of his shoulders and the way he carried his head. I clapped my hands upon Jim's sleeve, for I could see that his blood was boiling at the sight of the man, and that he was ready for any madness. But at that moment Bonaparte seemed to lean over and say something to de Lissac, and the party wheeled and dashed away, while there came the bang of a gun and a white spray of smoke from a battery along the ridge. At the same instant the assembly was blown in our village, and we rushed for our arms and fell in. There was a burst of firing all along the line, and we thought that the battle had begun, but it came really from our fellows cleaning their pieces, for their priming was in some danger of being wet from the damp night. From where we stood it was a sight now that was worth coming over the seas to see. On our own ridge was the checker of red and blue stretching right away to a village over 2 miles from us. It was whispered from man to man in the ranks, however, that there was too much of the blue and too little of the red, for the Belgians had shown on the day before that their hearts were too soft for the work, and we had 20,000 of them for comrades. Then, even our British troops were half made up of militiamen men and recruits, for the pick of the old peninsular regiments were on the ocean in transports, coming back from some fool's quarrel with our kinsfolk of America. But for all that we could see the bearskins of the guards, 2 strong brigades of them, and the bonnets of the Highlanders, and the blue of the old German Legion, and the red lines of Pack's brigade, and Kemp's brigade and the green-dotted riflemen in front, and we knew that come what might these were men who would bide where they were placed, and that they had a man to lead them who would place them where they should bide. Of the French we had seen little save the twinkle of their fires, and a few horsemen here and there upon the curves of the ridge. But as we stood and waited there came suddenly a grand blare from their bands, and their whole army came flooding over the low hill which had hid them, brigade after brigade and division after division, until the broad slope in its whole length and depth was blue with their uniforms, and bright with the glint of their weapons. It seemed that they would never have done, still pouring over and pouring over, while our men leaned on their muskets and smoked their pipes looking down at this grand gathering, and listening to what the old soldiers who had fought the French before had to say about them. Then when the infantry had formed in long deep masses their guns came whirling and bounding down the slope, and it was pretty to see how smartly they unlimbered and were ready for action. And then at a stately trot down came the cavalry, 30 regiments at the least, with plume and breastplate, twinkling sword and fluttering lance, forming up at the flanks and rear, in long shifting, glimmering lines. "Them's the chaps," cried our old sergeant. "They're gluttons to fight, they are. And you see them regiments with the great high hats in the middle a bit behind the farm. That's the guard, 20,000 of them, my sons, and all picked men, grey-headed devils that have done nothing but fight since they were as high as my gaiters. They've 3 men to our 2, and 2 guns to our 1, and by God, they'll make you recruities wish you were back in Argyle Street before they have finished with you." He was not a cheering man, our sergeant, but then he had been in every fight since Corunna, and had a medal with 7 clasps upon his breast, so that he had a right to talk in his own fashion. When the Frenchmen had all arranged themselves just out of cannon shot, we saw a small group of horsemen, all in a blaze with silver and scarlet and gold, ride swiftly between the divisions, and as they went a roar of cheering burst out from either side of them, and we could see arms outstretched to them and hands waving. An instant later the noise had died away, and the 2 armies stood facing each other in absolute deadly silence, a sight which often comes back to me in my dreams. Then, of a sudden, there was a lurch among the men just in front of us. A thin column wheeled off from the dense blue clump, and came swinging up towards the farmhouse which lay below us. It had not taken 50 paces before a gun banged out from an English battery on our left, and the Battle of Waterloo had begun. It is not for me to try to tell you the story of that battle, and indeed I should have kept far enough away from such a thing had it not happened that our own fates, those of the 3 simple folk who came from the border country, were all just as much mixed up in it as those of any king or emperor of them all. To tell the honest truth, I have learned more about that battle from what I have read than from what I saw, for how much could I see with a comrade on either side, and a great white cloud bank at the very end of my firelock? It was from books and the talk of others that I learned how the heavy cavalry charged, how they rode over the famous cuirassiers, and how they were cut to pieces before they could get back. From them, too, I learned all about the successive assaults, and how the Belgians fled, and how Pack and Kempt stood firm. But of my own knowledge, I can only speak of what we saw during that long day in the rifts of the smoke and the lulls of the firing, and it is just of that I will tell you. We were on the right of the line and in reserve, for the Duke was afraid that Boney might work round on that side and get at him from behind, so our 3 regiments with another British brigade and the Hanoverians were placed there to be ready for anything. There were 2 brigades of light cavalry, too, but the French attack was all from the front, so it was late in the day before we were really wanted. The English battery which fired the first gun was still banging away on our left, and a German one was hard at work upon our right, so that we were wrapped round with the smoke. But we were not so hidden as to screen us from a line of French guns opposite, for a score of round shot came piping through the air and plumped right into the heart of us. As I heard the scream of them past my ear, my head went down like a diver, but our sergeant gave me a prod in the back with the handle of his halbert. "Don't be so blasted polite," said he. "When you're hit you can bow once and for all." There was one of those bowls that knocked 5 men into a bloody mash, and I saw it lying on the ground afterwards like a crimson football. Another went through the adjutant's horse with a plop like a stone in the mud, broke its back and left it lying like a burst gooseberry. 3 more fell further to the right, and by the stir and cries we could tell that they had all told. "Ah, James, you've lost a good mount," says Major Reed, just in front of me, looking down at the adjutant, whose boots and breeches were all running with blood. "I gave a cool 50 for him in Glasgow," said the other. "Don't you think, Major, that the men had better lie down now that the guns have got our range?" "Tut," said the other, "they are young, James, and it will do them good." "They'll get enough of it before the day's done," grumbled the other. But at that moment Colonel Raynell saw that the rifles and the 52nd were down on either side of us, so we had the order to stretch ourselves out too. Precious glad we were when we could hear the shot whining like hungry dogs within a few feet of our backs. Even now a thud and a splash every minute or so, with a yelp of pain and a drumming of boots upon the ground, told us that we were still losing heavily. A thin rain was falling, and the damp air held the smoke low, so that we could only catch glimpses of what was doing just in front of us, though the roar of the guns told us that the battle was general all along the lines. 400 of them were all crashing at once now, and the noise was enough to split the drum of your ear. Indeed, there was not one of us but had a singing in his head for many a long day afterwards. Just opposite us on the slope of the hill was a French gun, and we could see the men serving her quite plainly. They were small active men, with very tight breeches and high hats with great straight plumes sticking up from them, but they worked like sheep shearers, ramming and sponging and training. There were 14 when I saw them first, and only 4 left standing at the last, but they were working away just as hard as ever. The farm that they called Hougoumont was down in front of us, and all the morning we could see that a terrible fight was going on there, for the walls and the windows and the orchard hedges were all flame and smoke, and there rose such shrieking and crying from it as I never heard before. It was half burned down and shattered with balls, and 10,000 men were hammering at the gates, but 400 guardsmen held it in the morning and 200 held it in the evening, and no French foot was ever set within its threshold. But how they fought, those Frenchmen! Their lives were no more to them than the mud under their feet. There was one, I can see him now, a stoutish ruddy man on a crutch. He hobbled up alone in a lull of the firing to the side gate of Hougoumont, and he beat upon it, screaming to his men to come after him. For 5 minutes he stood there, strolling about in front of the gun barrels which spared him, but at last a Brunswick skirmisher in the orchard flicked out his brains with a rifle shot. And he was only one of many, for all day when they did not come in masses, they came in 2s and 3s with as brave a face as if the whole army were at their heels. So we lay all morning, looking down at the fight at Hougoumont, but soon the Duke saw that there was nothing to fear upon his right, and so he began to use us in another way. The French had pushed their skirmishers past the farm, and they lay among the young corn in front of us popping at the gunners, so that 3 pieces out of 6 on our left were lying with their men strewed in the mud all round them. But the Duke had his eyes everywhere, and up he galloped at that moment, a thin, dark, wiry man with very bright eyes, a hooked nose and big cockade on his cap. There were a dozen officers at his heels, all as merry as if it were a fox hunt, but of the dozen there was not one left in the evening. "Warm work, Adams," said he as he rode up. "Very warm, your grace," said our general. "But we can outstay them at it, I think. Tut, tut, we cannot let skirmishers silence a battery. Just drive those fellows out of that, Adams." Then first I knew what a devil's thrill runs through a man when he is given a bit of fighting to do. Up to now we had just lain and been killed, which is the weariest kind of work. Now it was our turn, and my word, we were ready for it. Up we jumped, the whole brigade in a 4-deep line, and rushed at the cornfield as hard as we could tear. The skirmishers snapped at us as we came, and then away they bolted like corncrakes, their heads down, their backs rounded, and their muskets at the trail. Half of them got away, but we caught up the others, the officer first, for he was a very fat man who could not run fast. It gave me quite a turn when I saw Rob Stewart on my right stick his bayonet into the man's broad back and heard him howl like a damned soul. There was no quarter in that field, and it was butt or point for all of them. The men's blood was aflame, and little wonder, for these wasps had been stinging all morning without our being able so much as to see them. And now, as we broke through the further edge of the cornfield, we got in front of the smoke, and there was the whole French army in position before us, with only 2 meadows and a narrow lane between us. We set up a yell as we saw them, and away we should have gone slap at them if we had been left to ourselves, for silly young soldiers never think that harm can come to them until it is there in their midst. But the Duke had cantered his horse beside us as we advanced, and now he roared something to the general, and the officers all rode in front of our line holding out their arms for us to stop. There was a blowing of bugles, a pushing and a shoving, with the sergeants cursing and digging us with their halberts, and in less time than it takes me to write it, there was the brigade in 3 neat little squares, all bristling with bayonets and in echelon, as they call it, so that each could fire across the face of the other. It was the saving of us, as even so young a soldier as I was could very easily see, and we had none too much time either. There was a low rolling hill on our right flank, and from behind this there came a sound like nothing on this earth so much as the beat of the waves on the Berwick coast when the wind blows from the east. The earth was all shaking with that dull roaring sound, and the air was full of it. "Steady, 71st, for God's sake, steady," shrieked the voice of our colonel behind us, but in front was nothing but the green gentle slope of the grassland, all mottled with daisies and dandelions. And then suddenly over the curve we saw 800 brass helmets rise up, all in a moment, each with a long tag of horsehair flying from its crest, and then 800 fierce brown faces all pushed forward, and glaring out from between the ears of as many horses. There was an instant of gleaming breastplates, waving swords, tossing manets, fierce red nostrils opening and shutting, and hoofs pawing the air before us. And then down came the line of muskets, and our bullets smacked up against their armour like the clatter of a hailstorm upon a window. I fired with the rest, and then rammed down another charge as fast as I could, staring out through the smoke in front of me, where I could see some long, thin thing which napped slowly backwards and forwards. A bugle sounded for us to cease firing, and a whiff of wind came to clear the curtain from in front of us, and then we could see what had happened. I had expected to see half that regiment of horse lying on the ground, but whether it was that their breastplates had shielded them, or whether, being young and a little shaken at their coming, we had fired high, our volley had done no very great harm. About 30 horses lay about, 3 of them together within 10 yards of me, the middle one right on its back with its 4 legs in the air, and it was one of these that I had seen flapping through the smoke. Then there were 8 or 10 dead men, and about as many wounded sitting dazed on the grass for the most part, though one was shouting "Vive l'Empereur" at the top of his voice. Another fellow who had been shot in the thigh, a great black mustached chap he was too, leaned his back against his dead horse and, picking up his carbine, fired as coolly as if he had been shooting for a prize, and hit Angus Myers, who was only 2 from me, right through the forehead. Then he out with his hand to get another carbine that lay near, but before he could reach it, big Hodgson, who was the pivot man of the Grenadier Company, ran out and passed his bayonet through his throat, which was a pity, for he seemed to be a very fine man. At first I thought that the cuirassiers had run away in the smoke, but they were not men who did that very easily. Their horses had swerved at our volley, and they had raced past our square and taken the fire of the 2 other ones beyond. Then they broke through a hedge, and coming on a regiment of Hanoverians who were in line, they treated them as they would have treated us if we had not been so quick, and cut them to pieces in an instant. It was dreadful to see the big Germans running and screaming, while the cuirassiers stood up in their stirrups to have a better sweep for their long, heavy swords, and cut and stabbed without mercy. I do not believe that 100 men of that regiment were left alive, and the Frenchmen came back across our front, shouting at us and waving their weapons, which were crimson down to the hilts. This they did to draw our fire, but the colonel was too old a soldier, for we could have done little harm at the distance, and they would have been among us before we could reload. These horsemen got behind the ridge on our right again, and we knew very well that if we opened up from the squares they would be down upon us in a twinkle. On the other hand, it was hard to bide as we were, for they had passed the word to a battery of 12 guns, which formed up a few hundred yards away from us, but out of our sight, sending their bowls just over the brow and down into the midst of us, which is called a plunging fire. And one of their gunners ran up onto the top of the slope, and stuck a handspike into the wet earth to give them a guide, under the very muzzles of the whole brigade, none of whom fired a shot at him, each leaving him to the other. Ensign Sampson, who was the youngest subaltern in the regiment, ran out from the square and pulled down the handspike. But quick as a jack after a minnow, a lancer came flying over the ridge, and he made such a thrust from behind that not only his point, but his pennon too came out between the 2nd and 3rd buttons of the lad's tunic. "Helen, Helen," he shouted, and fell dead on his face, while the lancer, blown half to pieces with musket balls, toppled over beside him, still holding on to his weapon, so that they lay together with that dreadful bond still connecting them. But when the battery opened, there was no time for us to think of anything else. A square is a very good way of meeting a horseman, but there is no worse one of taking a cannon ball, as we soon learned when they began to cut red seams through us, until our ears were weary of the slosh and splash when hard iron met living flesh and blood. After 10 minutes of it we moved our square 100 paces to the right, but we left another square behind us, for 120 men and 7 officers showed where we had been standing. Then the guns found us out again, and we tried to open out into line, but in an instant the horsemen, lancers they were this time, were upon us from over the brae. I tell you we were glad to hear the thud of their hoofs, for we knew that that must stop the cannon for a minute and give us a chance of hitting back. And we hit back pretty hard too that time, for we were cold and vicious and savage, and I for one felt that I cared no more for the horsemen than if they had been so many sheep on Coromure. One gets past being afraid or thinking of one's own skin after a while, and you just feel that you want to make someone pay for all you have gone through. We took our change out of the lancers that time, for they had no breastplates to shield them, and we cleared 70 of them out of their saddles at a volley. Maybe, if we could have seen 70 mothers weeping for their lads, we should not have felt so pleased over it. But then, men are just brutes when they are fighting, and have as much thought as 2 bull pups when they've got one another by the throttle. Then the colonel did a wise stroke, for he reckoned that this would stave off the cavalry for 5 minutes, so he wheeled us into line, and got us back into a deeper hollow out of reach of the guns before they could open again. This gave us time to breathe, and we wanted it too, for the regiment had been melting away like an icicle in the sun. But bad as it was for us, it was a deal worse for some of the others. The whole of the Dutch Belgians were off by this time helter-skelter, 15,000 of them, and there were great gaps left in our line through which the French cavalry rode as pleased them best. Then the French guns had been too many and too good for ours, and our heavy horse had been cut to bits, so that things were none too merry with us. On the other hand, Hougoumont, a blood-soaked ruin, was still ours, and every British regiment was firm, though to tell the honest truth, as a man is bound to do, there were a sprinkling of red coats among the blue ones who made for the rear. But these were lads and stragglers, the faint hearts that are found everywhere, and I say again that no regiment flinched. It was little we could see of the battle, but a man would be blind not to know that all the fields behind us were covered with flying men. But then, though we on the right wing knew nothing of it, the Prussians had begun to show, and Napoleon had set 20,000 of his men to face them, which made up for ours that had bolted, and left us much as we began. That was all dark to us, however, and there was a time, when the French horsemen had flooded in between us and the rest of the army, that we thought we were the only brigade left standing, and had set our teeth with the intention of selling our lives as dearly as we could. At that time it was between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, and we had had nothing to eat, the most of us since the night before, and were soaked with rain into the bargain. It had drizzled off and on all day, but for the last few hours we had not had a thought to spare either upon the weather or our hunger. Now we began to look round and tighten our waist belts, and ask who was hit and who was spared. I was glad to see Jim, with his face all blackened with powder, standing on my right rear, leaning on his firelock. He saw me looking at him, and shouted out to know if I were hurt. "All right, Jim," I answered. "I fear I'm here on a wild-goose chase," said he gloomily, "but it's not over yet. By God, I'll have him or he'll have me." He had brooded so much on his wrong, had poor Jim, that I really believed that it had turned his head, for he had a glare in his eyes as he spoke that was hardly human. He was always a man that took even a little thing to heart, and since Eddie had left him I am sure that he was no longer his own master. It was at this time of the fight that we saw 2 single fights, which they tell me were common enough in the battles of old, before men were trained in masses. As we lay in the hollow, 2 horsemen came spurring along the ridge right in front of us, riding as hard as hoof could rattle. The first was an English dragoon, his face right down on his horse's mane, with a French cuirassier, an old, grey-headed fellow, thundering behind him on a big black mare. Our chaps set up a hooting as they came flying on, for it seemed shame to see an Englishman run like that. But as they swept across our front, we saw where the trouble lay. The dragoon had dropped his sword and was unarmed, while the other was pressing him so close that he could not get a weapon. At last, stung maybe by our hooting, he made up his mind to chance it. His eye fell on a lance beside a dead Frenchman, so he swerved his horse to let the other pass, and hopping off cleverly enough he gripped hold of it. But the other was too tricky for him, and was on him like a shot. The dragoon thrust up with the lance, but the other turned it, and sliced him through the shoulder blade. It was all done in an instant, and the Frenchman cantering his horse up the brae, showing his teeth at us over his shoulder like a snarling dog. That was one to them, but we scored one for us presently. They had pushed forward a skirmish line, whose fire was towards the batteries on our right and left rather than on us, but we sent out 2 companies of the 95th to keep them in check. It was strange to hear the crackling kind of noise that they made, for both sides were using the rifle. An officer stood among the French skirmishers, a tall, lean man with a mantle over his shoulders, and as our fellows came forward, he ran out midway between the 2 parties and stood as a fencer would, with his sword up and his head back. I can see him now, with his lowered eyelids and the kind of sneer that he had upon his face. On this the subaltern of the rifles, who was a fine, well-grown lad, ran forward and drove full tilt at him with one of the queer crooked swords that the riflemen carry. They came together like 2 rams, for each ran for the other, and down they tumbled at the shock, but the Frenchman was below. Our man broke his sword short off, and took the other's blade through his left arm, but he was the stronger man, and he managed to let the life out of his enemy with the jagged stump of his blade. I thought that the French skirmishers would have shot him down, but not a trigger was drawn, and he got back to his company with 1 sword through his arm and half of another in his hand.